When the neighbors stopped inviting Jones to go fishing, he realized that he was apparently not a very lucky companion for him, and if so, then he would not see either luck or catch with him. Jones was not upset, because he had never been an avid fisherman, but only believed even more in his bad luck. And when Carl, a friend of Jones, asked him to become a witness at the wedding, he initially decided to refuse because of his bad luck. However, seeing the trusting and pleading look of Carl, he nevertheless agreed in defiance of his own prejudices, so as not to offend his friend with a refusal. And so, when the day of the wedding came, Jones went to fetch Carl's bride. The car stopped in front of the house, where they were already waiting. From behind a lopsided fence and a gate without a wicket, women looked out, excited voices were heard, and quite understandable turmoil arose at this symbolic barrier, which had already lost its true purpose. Jones, seeing all this, suddenly limp with a sudden rush of lethargy, reluctantly opened the car door and fearfully stepped with his numb feet on the side of the road. "Ransom, ransom, so we won't give up, drive the ransom," shouted on the other side of the unsightly fence. Jones hesitated and, looking around, as if expecting help, hesitantly moved towards the loud voices. And while he hesitated, the most dexterous and impatient ones arrived in time. The bustle and hubbub of the bride's joke ransom grew, but Jones felt neither surprise nor pleasure from this game. It seemed to him annoying and false, like a wobbly, useless fence between squat houses, and even these houses with dirty gray facades and rusty brown roofs annoyed him with their appearance, like old rotten mushrooms. But in this skirmish and discord, Jones caught a girlish, iridescent, sonorous voice, painfully familiar to him. He seemed to wake up and, squinting, began to peer in the direction from which he heard this bewitching voice. In a moment, he saw in the doorway a thin girl in a lilac dress with light aluminum buttons. She laughed in a voice like a bell, then said something, and Jones, numb with surprise, froze in the aisle. The girl, looking at him, laughed again, but one of the pressing from behind pushed Jones in the back and he barely had time to smile at her. And somewhere nearby, a wallet with nickels, thrown by someone, rang. Laughter and not very persistent cries were heard. "Little, we won't give it for that." However, the living barrier was neatly pushed aside as a used decoration, the game crumpled without really capturing anyone, and Jones headed into the house with the others. They climbed the worn wooden steps to the second floor, where the bride lived, and then burst into the apartment with noise and joyful commotion. Jones, stopping in a cramped hallway, was able to make out in the middle of the room a bride in a white wedding dress and her pale, agitated face with uncontrollable, as if dancing lips, with which she created a simple but surprisingly sweet smile. Then everything started spinning, as in a round dance. And when they went to the registry office, Jones had already forgotten about an unfamiliar girl in a lilac dress with a familiar, like a bell, voice. The wedding conveyor in the wedding palace worked properly. Each pair of future newlyweds, a joyfully airy bride with a crimson groom and a little stern with faint restraint, entered the registration hall to the solemn sounds of music, like another pair of blanks in a special technological unit for the production of happiness. And they all followed the same path there, which ended with a general photograph of the happy newlyweds and invited persons at the entrance to the palace. Opposite, at the crossroads, stood two old houses, the shabby facades of which were covered with a huge panel depicting a full-length bearded man with an open book in his hand. In this way, on Fridays and Saturdays, the founder of scientific communism appeared from this panel before the eyes of all those present, as a symbol and guarantee of the future happy life of the newlyweds. Newlyweds of all countries, unite, already in a new way. As a call to them, the epigraph of the book was read in the hands of a bearded genius. And on the granite steps of the palace, the young joined in a little shy and timid kisses. At the same time, a small miracle took place, when the brides, kissing, looked a little askance at the panel. Some of them thought that a bearded man in an old-fashioned frock coat was winking mischievously at them. However, the miracle stopped there and the usual wedding procession began. Car horns sounded, and bells tinkled on potholes, trembling under the brass rings that twinkled in the car with the newlyweds. In the square, not far from the eternal flame, indifferently looking at military equipment, Jones again noticed a girl in a lilac dress. She fluttered like a butterfly around the bride and groom, deftly clicking the camera, and chirping something in an amazing voice. "Follow us, the command sounded in a military manner. Jones hesitated and again did not have time to meet a girl in a lilac dress, who had such a familiar and attractive voice. In the car, Jones relaxed and, closing his eyes, recalled the face of another girl from a distant youth, who had the same iridescent, sonorous, like a babbling fontanelle, an affectionate voice, but the usual voices of matchmakers were heard from behind. The matchmaker started to tell vulgar jokes, the matchmaker giggled, but Jones did not listen to anyone, only smiled fake, still remaining captive in his memories. Sometimes he looked around, noticing the joyful faces of people, especially women, who responded with kind smiles to the ringing of bells. "Alexander, witness, hey, you haven't fallen asleep?" the matchmaker asked. "What a witness he is to you," the matchmaker intervened. While they were figuring out among themselves who Jones was, the car drove up to a panel high-rise building, where they had already been met. The wedding feast developed according to the usual plot. The first toasts sounded, parting words to the young were heard, and praiseworthy speeches in honor of their parents. Then shouts of bitter began to be heard, followed by shy smiles and modest kisses of the newlyweds. There was enough noise and booze, but it didn't come to songs and dances yet. It so happened that next to Jones, at a cramped wedding table, was the same girl in a lilac dress, and he finally met her. Rita, that was the name of the girl. She hardly drank, but was cheerful and lively. The girl's lilac dress, along which the smooth aluminum buttons shone, sometimes diverged, and Jones stared at her slender legs and dark stockings. The apartment became stuffy and the faces of the people turned red from the booze and stuffiness. "No, this is not a wedding, but a natural steam room," said Jones and, turning to Rita, noticed how on her face, until recently so alive, a gray, indifferent expression froze. And he guessed that she was feeling bad. "Stuffy, and the heart is something," she answered his questioning look. Further in the wedding feast there was a hitch. It was difficult to get out of the corner where Jones and Rita were sitting. Someone opened the window, the breeze immediately blew out, bringing with it the desired coolness, and from the opposite end of the wedding table Rita was given the necessary pill. "This is rare, but it happens," said Rita, as if making excuses to Jones, and then everything goes away. The wedding went into its usual rut and rolled on, and Jones, in order to somehow maintain the prestige of a witness from the groom's side, issued 2 memorized toasts with an interval of a quarter of an hour. The people at the wedding roamed, and when the moment came to present gifts to the newlyweds, it became especially noisy and lively. Someone passed the tray over the hands of the invitees, and Jones, to cheers and applause, dropped the prepared envelope with his quarterly bonus into it. Rita's nausea, apparently, passed and she, as before, became lively and vociferous. "Look, look," the witness also gave. She shouted. "Look, look, hooray, hooray." Jones became embarrassed by everyone's attention. He almost bowed like an artist on stage. Soon they began to sing, though not very harmoniously. Then they pushed back the tables and tried to dance, but there was not enough space for everyone in the cramped space, so some of the people went out into the street. Jones decided to smoke in the yard where the button accordion was playing, and people were dancing on a small, trampled patch not far from the house. There he immediately noticed Rita, who famously tapped out with her heels. Jones looked at her in surprise, remembering that quite recently this thin and possibly sick girl was ill. Rita, seeing Jones, waved her hand, inviting him into the circle, while she continued to sing a ditty in a desperately mischievous voice. "My curly-haired shepherd boy. Belle, my dear. Our girls, like a cow. Beckons to the grove for itself. Belle, Belle," suddenly whispered Jones and thought, "Burn, girl, burn, burn like a candle." Jones did not dance. For some reason, he was not pleased with this fleeting union of the dancing people. He seemed to foresee in advance that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, many of them will simply forget everything, as something that has escaped their lives forever, and then, at a chance meeting, they may not even recognize each other. May evening came, music started playing in the apartment and dancing began. Jones danced with Rita, and then they sat by the window and talked. The quiet music did not bother them, only dancing couples sometimes hurt them when they gazed spellbound at the starry sky. On this blessed night it seemed to them that through the open window they looked into the fabulous paradise garden, beckoning them with its magic. Returning from the wedding, they chatted and imperceptibly lagged behind the noisy company. Jones swayed slightly as he walked, and Rita chuckled and called him drunk. However, he became sober every minute, and his soul was filled with a premonition of something unusual and joyful. And he had already firmly decided that he would certainly kiss his companion. And soon, at the crossroads, Jones drew her to him, saw very close a mysterious smile on Rita's lips and kissed the girl. Then they kissed again and again, and something strange happened to Jones. The rare passers-by at that time seemed to him not just wonderful, but almost family people, even a patrol policeman on the corner of the house with a radio chirping funny like a bird on his side. The soul was filled with something special and he laughed because of the inexplicable desire that arose in him to kiss a respectable aunt who was walking nearby with her dog. At the crossroads, brightly lamps were burning and they, jumping over a low fence in an embrace, ended up with Rita on the lawn, and then behind the billboards, next to the smelling lilac bushes. There they also kissed, and in the pauses between kisses they read a race of words that they could see in the light from the back of the billboards. "What a great occasion," said Rita in syllables. While Jones clumsily tried to read something, Rita, ahead of him, happily pronounced, "S holy and S sinful." They kissed again and then read the posters aloud again. And at these moments Rita seemed to him a hot, living leaf that was pressed against Jones's chest by the headwind. And he touched this intoxicating leaf, feeling its warmth and breath, but for some reason noticed an empty, without a button, loop on Rita's bra and peered intently in the direction where the ravine with protruding roofs of garages was dark. Poor thing, Jones thought, feeling for the straps. She danced so dashingly that the button came off. He flashed an evil and sticky, like an autumn fly, a thought, which he immediately drove away from himself, and Rita, as if guessing his thoughts, turned away from Jones and looked towards the poster. "To Clon," he heard her voice. Rita fell silent for a while, and then quietly said, "Don't shoot white swans, don't shoot white swans," she repeated once more, as if addressing someone. "Do not part with your loved ones." Jones almost automatically uttered a line of half-forgotten poems, and Rita picked him up and read the poems to the end. "Kogan," Jones said not quite confidently. "No, these are Koshetkov's poems," Rita replied, and Jones thought, "And you, dear, winding machine, not a simpleton, no, not a simpleton." The May night sobered Jones with its coolness. Taxis rushed past less and less, and the completely deserted streets were filled with an alarming silence. It was a long way to go on foot and it was too late. And Jones persuaded Rita to spend the night with her aunt who lived nearby. In the morning, after a short nap, Jones felt unwell, the effect of yesterday's wedding feast. Rita looked haggard too. She hardly spoke, behaved uncertainly in someone else's house, as if she was guilty before someone and refused breakfast, apparently in a hurry to get out of here as soon as possible. They walked in silence to the bus stop. There, Rita wrote down his phone number on a piece of paper, which she took out while fussing about in her purse. "Maybe a little change for the road to give?" Jones asked unsuccessfully, trying to somehow brighten up their silent parting. No, Rita's head swung several times like a bell, ding ding. And Jones saw very close her face with an unhealthy redness and eyes tired from insomnia. He looked round the drooping figure of Rita, her fragile shoulders with shoulder straps on a lilac dress with light buttons, and suddenly, somehow easily and simply, decided for himself that he was seeing this girl for the last time. "That's it, the ball is over, the candle has gone out," he thought, but instead of the desired relief came a viscous and incomprehensible emptiness. Rita froze in a tense position, as if anticipating something was amiss, and when the bus pulled up, Jones said to her at last, "Then after 12, today, agree," although he himself no longer believed in what he was saying. The bus left and Jones's mood soured altogether. He swore out loud with a dull, empty anger, and then quickly walked away from the place where he had just lied. At home, Jones sank tiredly onto the sofa, sinking into silence. From the street, from the side, through the walls and ceilings, a faint noise was heard to him, and the barely perceptible sounds of a piano penetrated. He listened attentively to these sounds and he visibly had the image of a girl in a white school apron, with a large bow on her head, who was diligently playing scales somewhere. The sounds carried away and it seemed to him that somewhere nearby, very, very close, an iridescent, sonorous, alluring voice of his beloved woman, from which he had lost his head in the distant past, and Jones came up with an unexpectedly simple, like all truths, thought, which sooner or later many are overtaken in this life. He realized that once he fell in love with the only woman whose voice he still remembered, and after, all the rest of the time, he only found in his memory the half-erased features of this particular woman and eagerly sought her unique, unforgettable voice, but already from other women, which fate gave him. This thought did not possess him for long. The phone rang in the room, from which he slightly flinched, but Jones did not get up and did not pick up the phone. A few minutes later the call was repeated, but he was still lying motionless on the sofa, although the phone kept jingling and rattling like a bell. The pauses between calls seemed to him shorter and shorter, and the calls were louder and more persistent. Jones was becoming unbearable to hear them and, quickly dressed, he jumped out into the street, not yet knowing what was happening to him and what awaited him. Another week began and slipped by, and on Saturday Jones called Carl. He asked to help him move some of the furniture in the apartment of the newlyweds. The most difficult thing was the matchmaker's table. She lived nearby, but they had to sweat, since the table could not fit into the elevator, and the apartment at the bridegroom was on the 9th floor. The recent groom, wanting to somehow stir up the gloomy Jones, asked, as if inadvertently, "How did your girlfriend spend that evening, huh?" I did it as it should," Jones replied in a choked voice, swallowing the sour driveway air. And she's nothing, huh? Cute, really, for my taste." Carl did not calm down. Leave me alone, you, for God's sake," Jones was angry. "I curse in my soul my friend's matchmaker, who lived so high." Finally, they went up to the top floor. The sleepy face of the matchmaker flashed in the hallway. They brought the table into the apartment and soon, taking their time to catch their breath, went downstairs. On the porch, Jones closed his eyes for a moment from the hot sun, lifted his head up and saw in the distance 2 aircraft trails, melting in the cloudless sky. A friend's indifferent voice was heard behind. "My wife told me last week that your girlfriend got sick at work. I had to call an ambulance. The heart, it turns out, is her." Jones tensed all over and felt a large and already cooled drop of sweat rolling down his hot body, along the spine. He shivered at the unpleasant sensation and said quietly, "Heart, you say," and added, barely moving his lips, "Oh, you, heart." But his friend, moving away from him, did not hear these words, and Jones, stumbling on the porch, waved his hands, involuntarily and clumsily, as if he wanted to hug someone or catch someone in the air, stumbling into emptiness,